Mark, and on behalf of both of us, thank the library and its trustees and the membership for having us. It's a great privilege and honor to be here. I love this place, and at a time when books seem to not be as valued as they used to be, this place reminds us that we're not all crazy. There is a place for us, and so Dr. Lockshin and I are very, very happy to be here. And also I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of our guest, Dr. Stephen Paget, Chief of Medicine at HSS in Rheumatology, and a great friend. Oh, you're having trouble hearing me? Can you hear me now? I feel like I'm running this cell phone ad. Is it all right now, Latrell? Is that all right?
Yeah.
But now we've got the bounce back. What am I doing wrong, Julian? Is it all right now?
Yes.
Are we all right now? Is that good? Yes? Yes. Anyway, let me go back to saying that we are particularly pleased to acknowledge the presence of our guest, Dr. Stephen Paget, who is Chief of Medicine and Rheumatology at the Hospital for Special Surgery, a great friend to our book and to me as a patient and, of course, a colleague of Dr. Lockshin's. So this is a book by a doctor and a patient. This the doctor, this the patient. And this doctor is not telling his stories and feelings about patients and interpreting what he thinks patients might feel, but he is, in fact, writing a book with a patient of his. So it's not a book by a doctor who's going to tell you all about a diagnosis quest or how patients present their stories. And in the terms of what I've done, it's not, although it is a memoir about a life lived with illness, it is not the genre of what I call the stall and wallow books of pain and whining. It is certainly honest, and at times I presume people find it a little difficult, but it is a book about a relationship, our relationship, which I think, as a person who has been chronically ill her entire life, the most challenging relationship of my lifetime is that with a physician. So, as Mark said, it's a dual memoir. We wrote and we responded to one another, not always in the same order. If you think of the book in liturgical terms, one of us is the petitioner, the other the respondent, and then it turns around. So in one case, I write about the difficulty, indeed the impossibility of maintaining an intimate relationship in my life over the long course because of illness, and Dr. Lockshin responds to that. In another case, he talks about what it's like to live inside a world that he doesn't fully understand emotionally, but understands totally medically, of other patients like myself and many far sicker than I. And I respond rather dramatically, "Oh my goodness, how do you do this?" So the point is that we learned from each other during this collaboration, and perhaps the nicest thing of all is how much we surprised each other. We thought we knew a lot about our doctor-patient relationship. I think that the patient-doctor relationship, if it works at all, is a stunning miracle. And that's something that is a little difficult to say because underneath it is a secret that I don't think is so easy to reveal. And it is simply stated that a doctor's status, success, professional triumph, work satisfaction, and often, in some cases, even financial gratification, is based in chronic illness on the limitations, the pain, suffering, and agony of the population he or she serves. And it's a difficult thing to say, but it needs to be said if we're to reach a point where, in a relationship that can never be fully equal, a doctor-patient relationship, we can come to a place where there is a kind of equality of understanding. Status differentials are very common in sociology, social sciences. We know a lot about conversations and lawsuits about abuses of power. But what we like to say is that it's also possible that there is a different model. There's a different model for a lifetime of illness and a lifetime of care. I think any doctor who chooses to write a book with a patient is very brave. I think that Dr. Lockshin is much braver in what he has done than what I have done. Because doctors are not usually in the business of revealing so much about what they feel or what might sometimes go wrong. And so for a physician to move from the protection of his or her world and the shield of the white coat is very brave. I was never going to write a book about being ill. My illness is not a total secret, but it's not something everyone in the world knows about. I have written other books, many articles. I wasn't going to do this, but we were more than encouraged by, where are you? We were more than encouraged by Mrs. Jane Lockshin, there you are, who is the mother of this book, who said, you know, this book, if you would do it, will be much stronger if you do it together than if either of you wrote one individually. I think if a patient feels that they can write a book with their own doctor, that in and of itself says something about this relationship. It says that there's an amazing amount of trust, and in our case, longevity. How a patient perceives time and the time spent with her doctor at any given moment in treatment is crucial and very different from the way a doctor has to or does perceive time. I think patients are storytellers. We tell stories. That's how we make sense of what's happening to us. Karen Blix and Isaac Dinesen once said there is no sorrow that cannot be borne if it is put into a story. Well, we somehow feel as patients that if we keep telling our stories, that our doctors will glean from our endless, perhaps sometimes relentless stories, a course of action, a treatment protocol, not always understanding in the midst of our pain or frustration that they've heard our stories before. They've heard them in different voices, in different ages, in different genders. Our stories are unique to us. They're not always unique to our doctors. And so there is that other sort of, we're the storytellers and they're watching their clocks. In inflammatory autoimmune disease, which is what I have and what Dr. Paget treat, in lay terms, for me, I simply say my body is turned against me. It often feels as if my body is eating itself. It's the metaphor that's worked for me. So time means something to me. Doctors keep a very precious time of their own. It's a different time than the time I keep and my sister and brother patients. When Dr. Lockshin is seeing me, I don't know what else is going on in his doctor world. He might have 4 patients in ER. He might have just gotten a text on his cell phone that someone that he's been treating is on the way in an ambulance. Someone may be calling him from some far-flung place in the world in deep trouble. We don't know what's going on with them, and usually we can't see beyond ourselves to understand that. Yet there is this dilemma that we feel often, I feel, and I know that other patients feel it as well, that in these diseases that eat us, we're eating up a doctor's time. So this can present a tension that can be unfortunate, because if the time factor is not somehow resolved or at least talked about or managed, it works against the possibility of navigating a full life with chronic disease. I think perhaps in the back of all of our minds, patients, we fear that the doctor thinks that we're wasting his or her time. I'm going to read just a brief quote that was in the New York Times on the 26th of July, and it was about a conference on artificial intelligence held at Asilomar earlier this year, about what's going to happen when robots and robotic non-humans start to outsmart us, and the scientists worry machines may outsmart man was the headline, and it was organized by Dr. Horvitz, a scientist at Microsoft, and I'm going to read just the last paragraph, which I think is every patient's secret belief and fear, and every good doctor's horror that we think this about them. Despite the concerns about artificial intelligence overwhelming human beings, Dr. Horvitz said that the people at this conference felt that these robotic humans, if you will, could compensate for human failing and frailties, and he demonstrated a voice-based system that would be used for patients to talk to a simulated physician on a television screen, and that simulated physician would respond with empathy. For example, a mother says in their demonstration that her child is very ill, and this doctor, simulated doctor, says, "Oh no, I'm so very sorry to hear that." And a physician afterwards told the facilitator, Dr. Horvitz, "What a great idea. I have absolutely no time for that." So that is an example of the big incentive, and surely what I think we saw as the mission of this book, that we wanted to indeed show and to tell that while we live in parallel worlds, if not parallel planets, we can keep a dual time. So this book is a dual memoir, but it tells the following story. It tells a story about a doctor who knows how to listen, so that this patient had more choices than to simply go away or to say, "No, I won't." Dr. Lockshin is going to talk about a very different kind of time, and a far more important time, how we measure time over a course of a lifetime, interrupted or challenged by illness, and the metaphor that he came up with that we used throughout.
Okay, I guess different kinds of time. I don't think I'm going to dwell about the time in the office. We need to do what we need to do. Actually, I'll tell you an anecdote because it only happened about 3 hours ago. In my office is a woman whom I've known for some time. Came in and just burst into tears in front of my secretary. And my secretary is she's superb and she knows what to do. So she put her in a private room, and we, there went that part of the afternoon. I was supposed to be doing something else. And what it was that her job had become impossible, largely because of the same sorts of things that Ms. Brill has talked about. And so we ended up talking about that. Actually, it cost me a book because I gave it to her to read what she has said about that, about how you deal with that. And those things, that's part of the life that physicians who deal with chronic illness deal with. But the time that we were talking about, when we sat to talk about this book, and I'll give a slightly different story. We were at having lunch together at my home and having a conversation about communication between doctors and physicians. And that's Ms. Brill's training, and she knows how to analyze it. She has a vocabulary and an intellectual structure for that she was giving, basically telling us what we were saying when we were saying this. And that's where my wife said, "You have to write about this." And we both demurred and said, "No, we're not going to do it." And then we got pushed a little bit more and so on. And it happened. But then we were trying to think about how do you organize this book? And clearly it was going to be the fact that I've known Ms. Brill for 30 years and that there were evolutions on that. But the other part of it was just how you conceptualize time was an issue. And for a different part of my life, I'd spent time in the Maya lands in Mexico and Guatemala and was familiar with the Maya calendar. And it's not a decimal calendar. It doesn't operate the way, we count things, we tend to count in decimals. The Mayas counted with different time frames, which were basically instant time, what I refer to as instant time, calendar, clock time, calendar time, and generational time. So that you think of things, and physicians do this all the time. Someone collapses here, has a seizure, has a heart attack, that's instant. You respond, you do something, or something doesn't happen. Someone calls and tells you you have a fever, that they have a fever, and they're just aching or something, that's sort of clock time. You start planning, you've got a treatment, you've got a surgery, you've got something coming on, you have a vacation, or you need to go somewhere, you need to go back to school, is calendar time. But we often deal in generational time. And one of the things that probably happens most when I encounter patients, and several of you know, that by and large the diseases that I deal with start in young youth. That's tautologic, but we became ill at 12. I happen to have seen today 3 people that I'm seeing who are 19 years old. And what happens when I see a person like that initially is that I have to do what's necessary. She's usually in pain and frightened and so on. She wants to get rid of the pain now, and that's the goal. But I have lots of different ways of doing this, but some of which are going to impact her 6 months from now, and some of which are going to impact her 30 years from now. And I use the term her because it's mostly women that have these types of diseases. And then I have to sit and plan. How do we talk about, we need to do this. I can get rid of the pain today, but this is going to cost you a lot when you're 40. And 19-year-olds don't think in those terms. But I have to think of that, and I have to think ahead of the person for that. So when you talk about what's going through your mind simultaneously as you sit across the table from a youngster who's first encountering this sort of thing, I'm sitting and looking at this youngster, but I'm trying to think of what's going to happen if and when she finds someone that she wants to spend her life with, if and when she wants to have a child. How is she going to be a mother? Can she be a grandmother? And so on. And then work out, not on the day of the first visit, but on then weeks and months of the subsequent visits, how we engage with this, and then listen to what she has to say, try to get her to understand what I'm trying to say, and we basically negotiate the position back and forth. I have a phrase which I use several times a week, probably, and which you've heard many times, and that is, in my world, everything is negotiable until I say it's not negotiable. And that literally means there are most of the decisions that I have to deal with, medical decisions, are not life and death. They're choices and priorities of what's your worst case scenario, having the drug effects or having the illness recur, and that sort of thing. And we negotiate this a good deal. One part of my negotiation, and this is in your chapter, is that I have an article I tore out of a journal years ago about a young woman who was very, very sick with one of the diseases we deal with and was hospitalized. And she signed out against medical advice, getting sick of what her doctors were doing to her, and disappeared for several weeks. the doctors were writing up what happened. She reappeared completely well on no medications. And they asked what happened to her. Well, she was a girl from the Philippines, and she had gone home to a witch doctor who removed the curse that her ex-boyfriend had placed on her. And I have that in my office largely to say that, and this is true, that most of what we do is guesswork. We don't really have terribly solid science that proves that this and this and this will happen. And so we negotiate around the edges and try to relieve pain and try to keep the 19-year-old be a 39-year-old or a 69-year-old at the same time. The issues that come and the tears that come, and there's a chapter also in the book about this, is when things are going along swimmingly. Everything's just beautiful and so on, and suddenly the disease comes back. We don't have huge, great predictive tools to tell that, but suddenly the image that I used, and it happened because I go on weekends to a place up in Westchester, and I had just, Alida was emailing me at one point, and she was not in New York and was in trouble somewhere, and it happened that I saw a red-tailed hawk that is friendly to our woods come into my eyesight at the time, and that struck me as part of the metaphor that the life is going along well, and suddenly there's violence because the hawk goes and tears up a rabbit or something like that. Just with no warning, it's there, and the disease is back, and then we have to deal with it again. During this, it's very hard to plan lives. It's very hard for someone to create an existence, but Ms. Brill has been brilliant in doing so, despite that. And I guess we can segue into that part that talks about how you define yourself in the face of chronic illness.
Absolutely, but I want to just say that one of the surprises, I talked about surprising each other when I came to Dr. Lockshin through a reference. I moved here from Berkeley when I was not yet 30, and I had a reference to him from my physician in San Francisco, but I didn't use it because I was feeling well. And then I got very sick very suddenly, and I still wasn't going to see him, and I got through the flare on my own, and it was actually then my gynecologist, who was also attending at New York Hospital, who said, you have to go see Michael Lockshin. Well, then I did wait till I was better, but in terms of surprising each other in this book, I ran into Dr. Lockshin, many years ago, and I had gone into a spontaneous remission, and our relationship as a doctor and patient was still very formal, and we had not yet become at all social friends, and so I didn't call him and say, I'm feeling well. I just didn't need to see him. So I ran into him. A friend of mine's husband was doing a fellowship in oncology, and I'd had lunch with her across the street, and he was walking back to his side of Hospital Row, and I said, Dr. Lockshin, I'm well. Look at me. It's gone. It's gone forever. I'm really well. And I was so excited to see him on the street. It was this beautiful day, and I was expecting this great response from this beloved doctor. And he looked at me and he said, oh yes, they do that sometimes. And I was so crushed. And I went home just a few blocks from the hospital, and I thought, well, what a response to my remission. Of course, 3 months later, I was in intensive care having a little exploratory commotion with my lung. He never knew that he had hurt me until he read the book, and then it hurt him a little bit. So it was a very interesting moment. But how one composes a life such as mine, and maybe a number of you who have come. Chronic illness has in the middle of it these things that Dr. Lockshin and Dr. Paget and any other physician here, I suppose, call remissions. I call them dirty tricks, because you really do think in that interlude in that interlude, that it is gone. And you have to get to be kind of old before you understand that it isn't gone, it's a vacation. And I think one of the reasons that I was able to step back and work with him on this book is that I wanted to be able for us to give something to those young women especially who lose hope and lose their way. So how is it that you can still have something you pretend or hope to call a real life, a full life? And I think I have had one. I'm not sure I've always been so brilliant at it, but I do think I've tried to live as fully as possible. It's simply the desire to be seen as yourself. And Dr. Lockshin calls a chapter, I am me. I am me. I'm not this enormous, large signboard of neon symptoms flashing on and off as the text with this little tiny footnote called Alida Brill at the end. I'm not, and none of us who are chronically ill are just a whole sheaf of tests that have to be had and adventures toward the ultimate journey of the elusive, impossible, and confusing thing called clear or clean diagnosis. I had been a fan of the writings of Flannery O'Connor for a very long time. I love her style. I didn't know when I was a young, ill, unwell girl, young woman, that she had died of lupus. I'm glad I didn't know it when I was young. But her collection of letters, compiled by her friend Sally Fitzgerald, the collection is called The Habit of Being. Because when people would say to Flannery, how can you go on like this? You're so sick, how can you go on? She would simply say, well, it's the habit of being. And that little phrase has become for me a mantra for those of you who work with that, or a kind of a daily prayer for me. I've reached a place in my life where I'm humbled by my disease more than I am angered by it now. I also respect it. I respect its inventive, relentless, stubborn tenacity. And I guess in a strange way, I'm sort of in awe of it, that it won't go away completely. But I'm also completely in awe of the rheumatologists who stay with us despite the fact that we don't have cure yet. We have a promising lupus trial this summer, but there isn't cure. And yet they don't desert us either. I think that there's a lot that is often said. Of course, I sort of live in these two worlds because I have a professional relationship with my doctor as a patient, but also as a colleague because we've written this book together. So I have this dual passport. I also sit in infusion rooms and I go to talk to a number of patient support groups. And people often complain that